Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. This morning I'm looking at a curious book, but one I found fascinating to read. This has come to us from Edward Elgar Publishing Limited, which is an independent family publishing concern. They produce some very high-level publications, and this one is a particularly interesting book. It's got a fascinating title as well. It's got the title Constitutional Sunsets and Experimental Legislation. It's been written by Sofia Ranchordas, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Elizabeth and I have given it a title, A Jurisprudential Look at Temporary Legislation Across a Range of Jurisdictions. Let's just have a look at the book. Well, I wonder where that is at the front. You can see there's a nice picture there of America, of the Washington. Again, there's the spine and then there's the back. This is the Elgar monographs in constitutional administrative law. The series editors are Rosalind Dixon, Susan Rose Ackerman and Mark Tushnet. Now, the book itself is not a particularly big one. It's a hardback, but it's not a particularly heavy book. It's just over 200 odd pages long. There's a very short index at the back, which I'll show you there. Then you've also got a very detailed bibliography, which you'll find quite helpful. It goes on for some considerable time. Then you've got a structure, and this structure, this is actually, again you can see, paragraph numbering, subheads and paragraph numbering, which is very helpful throughout. There are some substantial footnotes, and obviously they cross-refer to the main bibliography at the back. But this is obviously a very well constructed part of the Elgar monographs. There's the front page there. Again, very much a very high quality book. There's a very touching note for the who this is dedicated to. I like to mention that because it's decent. Nice of them to do that. 4 parts, you can see what parts are covered, 4 in total. Introduction, legal framework, beyond the law and conclusion at the end. Some acknowledgements, and then we go into part 1. Then you've got the heading, then your little quote, then the paragraph numbering, footnotes and so on, and then you run all the way through. And you can read the book reasonably well. It's a heavy book in the sense that it's covering a large number of jurisdictions, because we're looking here at our global community, and many of the books that I'm now reviewing as we get in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. I've been doing these reviews for some 15 years on and off, and we are moving very much now towards global books concerning legal positions, because I do think we're moving certainly within the European Union, much more towards some form of jurisprudential consensus. So it's useful to see, when they talk about constitutional sunsets and experimental legislation, how far we're going to move the jurisprudence along. And I think partly that's what Sophia had in mind, although of course there's a huge amount of detail involved in the book. This is what we say. Even if you are a lawyer, you may find yourself a little baffled by the title of the book, and that's a good thing. Bafflement excites curiosity, the noble catalyst for all inquiry and research. For lawyers and for jurisprudents especially, this is a book to explore, savour, analyse and discuss. It's recently been published by Elgar, and it could conceivably emerge as a definitive statement on constitutional sunsets and experimental legislation, as these legislative mechanisms acquire more widespread acceptance and therefore familiarity. And as I've said before, we are in a global community, so therefore we are looking at it not as just compartments anymore, but much more on a wider basis. But as the author, Sofia Ranchordas, admits, most lawyers are not familiar with sunset clauses and experimental legislation, adding that a number of examples of these instruments from different jurisdictions are provided throughout the book. She goes on to explain in detail what these instruments are, what they do and how they evolve within a number of jurisdictions. Both constitutional sunsets and experimental legislation, she explains, are temporary legislative instruments, while experimental regulations aim to be a first step towards lasting legislation. Sunset clauses are usually born to fulfil a mission, and then they die after a fixed, that is, a predetermined period. In other words, a sunset clause then is time limited as a piece of legislation with a sell-by date. Experimental legislation is simply that, experimental. I would point out, of course, that you could argue, for instance, that any piece of legislation is a sunset clause because no successive parliament can bind a previous parliament, so a new parliament can produce whatever legislation it wants. Certainly in this country it can. So therefore you can see that you've got to be a bit careful with some of the terminology here, but you get an idea about the clauses that are being put forward. In other words, the predetermined period for which they're going to be there. And it appears that these temporary legislative instruments can, to put it bluntly, be chucked out if they're unpopular or don't work, or are shown demonstrably not to work. Interesting point that, if you think about it with British legislation. Many legislators might find such instruments to be rather an attractive idea as a practical response to the rapid pace of societal and technological change in developed cultures. This point is of course debatable, especially in countries with parliamentary systems such as the UK, Canada and so on, in which Parliament, the lawmaking body, is finite in the first place, and where a law enacted in a current Parliament can be changed or repealed in the next if found to be flawed in any way, which calls for urgent change. Or of course there's the political dimension, like for instance the Hunting Act. I mean, the point is quite clearly made about retrospective activity. I mean, that's what this is really pointing towards. Interestingly, the author has chosen to focus this study on 3 countries: Netherlands, Germany and the US. She cites quotes, for example, from recent and non-recent American law journals about sunset legislation and sunset provisions in anti-terrorism legislation. That's in the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law in 2010. This is not a technical book, she notes. This is a comparative law study that reflects on the framework, potentialities and constitutional limits of these legislative instruments. Good point. Let me conclude by saying, as a valid, effortful and carefully researched contribution to the study of jurisprudence, this book merits a place in the professional library of many a practitioner, especially those specialising, we think, in international law. The publication date is 2014. To show the book again very quickly, you can see what it is. It's not a big book. Obviously it does concentrate very much, but the reason you've got the United States, Washington on the front, is purely because it really is going much more towards that market. But it's making important points, I think, globally. Just opening it in the middle, you see again, you've got the paragraph numbering, you've got the footnotes. Right at the end, you've also got a huge amount of information in terms of the bibliography. A lot of work has gone into this, a lot of cross-referencing, and it's an excellent publication. I'm sure it will add tremendously to the debate. Possibly not quite so much in this country, but certainly I would have thought in America. I'd like to thank certainly all of those involved in producing this, because I think it's an interesting debate for the future. I do say the word of warning about the UK Parliament's retrospective concepts, but the point I would make is that you can see here the approaches that are being adopted. If we're going to have a 5-year fixed-term Parliament, which may well continue after the 7th of May 2015, we may well have that continuing. We'll have to wait and see. But certainly it's an interesting point, and I think also a pointer in the direction we may well be going towards as we go towards the middle of this century. Anyway, thank you to all concerned for a most interesting and, as I found, thought-provoking subject. Bye-bye.